This is a ghost story, but every part of it is real. A 9-year-old girl vanishes on her way to church in a small, quiet coal town. For 58 years, her killer remains a phantom, a nameless shadow haunting an entire community. Generations of police try and fail to identify him. The case goes ice cold. Then, a high school student with a laptop decides to hunt that phantom down. This isn't a screenplay from Hollywood. It's the true account of how a teenager accomplished what seasoned law enforcement could not and solved one of America's most baffling cold cases. What if I told you the key to unlocking a 60-year-old murder wasn't stored in a dusty evidence locker but was waiting on a public ancestry website? We all grew up hearing cautionary tales about staying safe in our neighborhoods. But what happens when the boogeyman is a real person and for decades nobody can find him? Have you ever heard a story like this from your own hometown? The core problem here wasn't just a lack of evidence. It was a lack of imagination. The system was stuck, and a family was left without answers for nearly 6 decades. So how did a teenager with no badge and no budget piece together a puzzle that had stumped investigators since 1964? Stick with me as we break down the incredible case of Maurice Chiverella. If you believe that no case should ever go cold, hit that like button and subscribe now, because this is a story you won't forget. To understand the crime, you first have to understand the place. This was Hazleton, Pennsylvania in 1964, a small coal mining town built on the backs of European immigrants. It was a community defined by 3 things: hard work, family, and faith. Life revolved around the church calendar, the mine whistle, and the Sunday dinner table. It was a place where doors were often left unlocked and kids walked to school without a second thought. The people of Hazleton believed in looking out for one another. They felt insulated from the kinds of horrors they might see on the national news. A tragedy of this magnitude just wasn't supposed to happen here. At the heart of this world was the Chiverella family. They were hard-working Italian immigrants, devout Catholics who were raising their children with a firm belief in discipline, education, and God. Their American dream was simple: a better, safer life for their kids. 9-year-old Maurice Ann Chiverella was a perfect reflection of that dream. Friends and family remembered her as a bright and curious little girl, deeply devoted to her parents and siblings, and a beloved presence in her church community. She was the kind of child every parent prayed for: innocent, happy, and full of life. The morning of March 18, 1964 began like any other. It was a Wednesday during Lent, and Maurice had a small, important task. As part of a church project, she was to carry a few cans of food from her home to the nearby St. Joseph's Church. It was a short walk, a simple act of faith she had likely done before. Her family watched her leave, a small girl on a charitable mission. It was a completely ordinary moment, the kind that happens 1,000 times in 1,000 small towns. But this ordinary moment would be their last memory of her alive. Hours began to stretch into an eternity. Maurice didn't come home. She wasn't at the church. A quiet concern soon grew into outright panic. The family's calls became more frantic, and soon the entire community was on alert. The search began, but it ended in the worst way possible. Her small body was found on an abandoned strip mining road. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The violence inflicted upon her was so profound, it was incomprehensible, even to the most hardened investigators who arrived on the scene. The news didn't just spread through Hazleton, it tore through the town's very soul. The sense of safety they had cherished was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying reality. For the Chiverella family, their world didn't just fall apart, it was utterly destroyed, and the search for answers had only just begun. The investigation began with a surge of determination, but it immediately ran into a wall of limitations. This was 1964. The world of forensics as we know it today simply did not exist. There was no DNA analysis, no digital databases, no high-tech equipment to pull a killer's identity from a single strand of hair. Detectives were working with the basics: fingerprinting, which often yielded smudges, and blood typing, which could only narrow down a suspect pool to millions of people. They did what they could, meticulously combing the crime scene, but the evidence they gathered offered few answers. Leads dried up almost as quickly as they appeared. The close-knit nature of Hazleton, once a source of comfort, became an obstacle. In a town where everyone knew each other, secrets were kept tightly, and a deep-seated distrust of outsiders made many residents hesitant to talk. The police were left with a handful of theories and a growing sense of frustration. While the case file collected dust, the Chiverella family lived in a state of suspended grief. For them, there was no moving on, no sense of closure. Maurice's mother was reportedly consumed by guilt for allowing her daughter to walk to the church alone that morning, a weight she would carry for the rest of her life. For Maurice's siblings, the tragedy cast a long shadow over their entire existence. They grew up with a constant gnawing fear, forever altering their marriages, their careers, and the way they raised their own children. The pain of not knowing who did this was a unique form of torment. The killer, they feared, could be anyone. The man they passed in the grocery store, the neighbor who waved from across the street, the person sitting a few pews behind them at church. He was a ghost living among them. Decades passed. The case was handed down from one generation of detectives to the next, becoming a piece of department lore, a cursed heirloom that no one could put to rest. The file grew thicker, filled with dead-end tips, false confessions, and forgotten rumors. Some investigators believed the killer was a transient who had simply passed through town, while others were convinced he was a local hiding in plain sight. Controversies arose over the years, with some family members insisting that early leads were mishandled and potential witnesses were never properly questioned. Hope faded, and the case became a cautionary tale, a story whispered by families to remind their children that monsters were real. For over half a century, that was the end of the story. A tragedy with no justice. It makes you wonder how many other families are out there waiting. Let me know in the comments if you think law enforcement should invest more in solving cold cases. Your engagement helps bring more attention to stories like Maurice's. Decades after Maurice's death, the world of criminal justice was transformed by a scientific revolution, DNA. For the first time, cold cases that had been dormant for generations were being solved with near certainty. In the early 2000s, investigators on the Chiverella case felt a renewed surge of optimism. Remarkably, some of the biological evidence from the 1964 crime scene had been preserved. It was a long shot, but they sent it for analysis. The result was a breakthrough beyond their wildest hopes. They successfully extracted a complete DNA profile of the killer. After decades of dead ends, they finally had a piece of him. The next step was standard procedure. Run the profile through CODIS, the National Criminal Database, to see if it matched any known offenders. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The results came back. Nothing. No match. The killer wasn't in the system. After a brief moment of incredible hope, the case hit another brick wall. It was a crushing blow, and it seemed the killer's identity would remain a secret forever. But then, another new science emerged, one that didn't rely on catching criminals, but on tracing families. It's called genetic genealogy. You've probably heard of it. It's the same revolutionary method that identified the Golden State Killer. The process is brilliant. Investigators take the unknown killer's DNA and upload it to public genealogy websites like GED Match, where everyday people share their DNA to find relatives. The goal isn't to find the killer, but to find a distant cousin, a second, third, or even fourth cousin. Once they find a relative, they can start building a massive family tree, working backward through generations to pinpoint exactly where the unknown suspect must fit. It's an incredibly complex and time-consuming process. And for the Maurice Chiverella case, the person who would take it on wasn't a seasoned detective. Enter Eric Schubert. In 2019, he was a high school student from New Jersey who had a very unusual hobby. While other kids were playing sports or video games, Eric was deep into genealogy. He had started mapping his own family tree in middle school and quickly developed a sophisticated, almost obsessive talent for it. He didn't just see names and dates, he saw patterns, connections, and stories. Believing his skills could be used for more than a hobby, he began offering his help to law enforcement agencies on cold cases. It was an audacious move, but the Pennsylvania State Police, facing yet another dead end in their most infamous cold case, decided to take an unconventional chance. They gave the teenager a shot. The task before him was monumental. The killer's DNA had thousands of potential distant relatives in the database. Eric was now faced with a vast tangled web of family lines stretching back centuries. His job was to reconstruct the killer's family tree from scratch. Working with painstaking precision, he began the slow process of elimination. He sifted through census records, birth certificates, and obituaries, mapping out entire family branches, only to rule them out and start over. It was a digital investigation of epic proportions, requiring thousands of hours of meticulous, often frustrating work. But slowly, piece by piece, he began to untangle the threads of history, getting closer and closer to giving the phantom a name. For months, Eric Schubert worked relentlessly, navigating a labyrinth of public records and DNA connections. It was a process of elimination on a massive scale. He would build out a family line for generations, tracing ancestors from Italy to Pennsylvania, only to find a detail that didn't fit, forcing him to discard weeks of work and start again. Thousands of potential relatives were examined and dismissed. The digital family tree on his screen was a battlefield of crossed-out names and broken links. But through the painstaking process, one specific branch of the tree kept coming into focus. It was a family with deep roots in the Hazleton area, a family that was living there in March of 1964. As he dug deeper into this one lineage, the possibilities narrowed from dozens of people to a handful, and then, finally, to a single individual. After more than a year of work, Eric had his eureka moment. He had a name. He passed his findings to the Pennsylvania State Police, pointing them toward a man named James Paul Fort. The name meant nothing to the public, but to law enforcement, it was a lightning bolt. James Paul Fort was a Hazleton resident. He had been 22 years old at the time of Maurice's murder. Critically, he had a documented history of violent behavior and sexual assault. He was a local man who had lived and worked in the same small town, walking the same streets as the Chiverella family. He was not a phantom who drifted in and out of town. He was a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. There was just one problem. Fort had died of natural causes back in 1980, taking his secrets to the grave. Eric's genealogical work was incredible, but investigators needed absolute scientific proof. They needed Forte's DNA. Since he had been dead for decades, they turned to the next best thing, a living relative. Investigators approached a member of Fort's family, explained the situation, and asked for a DNA sample to compare against the evidence from the crime scene. The relative agreed. The sample was sent to the lab for a final definitive test. The results came back. It was a perfect match. The DNA from the man who assaulted and killed Maurice Chiverella was irrefutably linked to the family of James Paul Fort. After 58 years of silence, of grief, of not knowing, the ghost finally had a name. This is the moment that changes everything. If you find this breakthrough as incredible as I do, share this video with someone. These stories of hope and persistence deserve to be heard. The announcement in 2022 brought the Chiverella family a resolution, but it was a bittersweet one. There was an undeniable sense of relief in finally knowing the name of the man who had taken their sister from them. But justice itself was out of reach. James Paul Fort would never stand trial, never face a jury, and never be forced to answer for what he did. For Maurice's siblings, the knowledge was both a comfort and a new kind of pain. One sibling expressed the torment of realizing she had likely crossed paths with Fort countless times in their small town over the years. Another said that the closure didn't heal the wound, but it finally defined it. The solution to this case leaves us with critical lessons. First, it shows the incredible power of unconventional thinking. A teenager with a unique skill succeeded where traditional methods had failed for decades, proving that answers can come from the most unexpected places. Second, it underscores the vital importance of preserving evidence. That small biological sample collected in 1964 was the thread that connected the past to the future, allowing science to finally speak when it was ready. And finally, it's a solemn reminder that for families of victims, the pain never truly goes away. The Chiverellas endured nearly 60 years of unresolved trauma, a wound that no headline can ever fully erase. Maurice Chiverella was robbed of her future in 1964, but in 2022, because of a teenager who refused to believe impossible was a permanent state, her story finally found its ending. It's a reminder that justice can be delayed, But with new technology and relentless dedication, it never has to be denied. Thank you for joining me at the crime scene. If you want to see more deep dives into cases like this, make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell turned on. Until next time, stay vigilant.